The strange and the spooky, adventurous and loony, they're all together ooky, the Bud family. Their trips are amazing when people come to see 'em. They really are amazing, the Bud family. History, ghost, art. So put on a witch's shawl on, a seat so you can relax on. We're gonna play a call on the Bud family. Welcome to Hump Day. If you haven't heard, we're doing a thing in November and December. So keep an eye out or an ear out for information. I'm not giving you all the details yet. You're just gonna have to wait. But before that, this is a video of Joe rambling about history stuff. We need to do shut up. Ready? Ready? Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so it's for you. The shout out is for our friend. Let's see who it is today. Clown race, because clowns are scary, right? Here we go. Let's see. Oh, lots of bright colors today. We've got Buddha, we've got Logan's, Myers, One Busy, Sheena, Buddy, Just Doing, Debbie, My Crafty Cemeteries, Kenny and Debbie, Intrepid. Let's see, Sheena, Pete. Sarah's currently in the lead. There's Motivation. There's Days Camping. And from the back, we've got Pins and Glover. And Verna. Here, there's Hillbilly and Kaz. Reef, Lashes, Spectral. Oh, is it going to be Pete? It's going to be Pete. Okay, we have here Scratching Pete. As you can see, he does lots of scratch tickets. He's a very supportive dude. This is my scratch ticket. My mission on Scratching Pete is to find out if I can profit by scratching lottery tickets over a period of 1 year. Have you been doing this more than a year? I'm going to say you've been doing this more than a year. Let's see, there's a 1 year, 2 year. Yep, he's been doing it for 1 year. He'll keep doing it until it benefits. Or you just do it for fun. I don't know, I'm confused now. I'm very curious, but that's okay. Pete's awesome, very supportive. Check him out. Like, share, comment. Have a good day. Alright, Mr. Bud, you're going to ramble about war crimes?
Not quite. There's a battle called the Battle of Leyte Gulf that happened on this date in October 1944. Now, interestingly enough, this battle, by the numbers, was the largest naval battle in World War II, and by some criteria, largest naval battle in history, with over 200,000 naval personnel involved. Now, it was fought in the waters near the Philippine islands of Leyte, Samar, and Luzon from the 23rd to the 26th of October between the American and Australian forces and the Imperial Japanese Navy as part of the invasion of Leyte, which aimed to isolate Japan from the colonies that it had occupied in Southeast Asia, also cutting off a vital source of industrial and oil supplies. By the time of the battle, Japanese had fewer capital ships, aircraft carriers and battleships left than the Allied forces had total aircraft carriers, which underscored the disparity in force strength at that point of the war. Regardless, the Imperial Japanese Navy mobilized nearly all of its remaining major naval vessels in an attempt to defeat the Allied invasion, but it was stopped by the U.S. Navy's 3rd and 7th Fleets. Now, the background off of what they were working with, Allied campaigns of August 1942 and early 1944 had driven the Japanese forces from many of their island bases in the South and Central Pacific, while isolating many other bases, basically the starve them on the vine theory. They were able to cut off the Solomon Islands, Bismarck Archipelago, the Admiralty Islands, New Guinea, Marshall Islands, and Wake Island, and by June of 1944, a series of American amphibious landings, supported by the 5th Fleet's Fast Carrier Task Force, took most of the Mariana Islands, bypassing Rota. This offensive breached the Japanese strategic inner defense ring and gave the Americans a base from which they could launch the B-29s against the Japanese home islands. Now, the Japanese counterattacked with the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The U.S. Navy destroyed 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, damaged other ships, and shot down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft, leaving the Japanese Navy with very little carrier-borne air power and few experienced pilots. However, the considerable land-based air power the Japanese had amassed in the Philippines was thought to be too dangerous to bypass by many high-ranking officers outside of the Joint Chief of Staff, including Admiral Chester Nimitz. So then America basically had 2 choices. They could go after Formosa, which would give them a chance to land into mainland China, or when you have a certain general named Douglas MacArthur, who made the promise in 1942, "I shall return," wanted to invade the Philippines. Well, Formosa could serve as that jumping point for mainland China, which MacArthur felt was unnecessary. It also is estimated that it would require about 12 divisions of Army and Marines. Meanwhile, the Australian Army, spread thin by engagements with the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and other Pacific islands, would not have been able to spare any troops for such an operation. As a result, the invasion of Formosa, or any operation much larger ground forces than were available in the late 1944, would be delayed until the defeat of Germany freed the necessary manpower. That happened over in 1945. Now, the decision to invade the Philippines, again a meeting with MacArthur, Nimitz, and President Roosevelt, helped confirm the Philippines as a strategic target, but they did not reach a decision, and the debate continued for about 2 months. Eventually, Nimitz changed his mind and agreed to MacArthur's plan, and it would be eventually decided that MacArthur's forces would invade the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. Amphibious forces and close naval support would be provided by the 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid. Now, the U.S. 7th Fleet at this time contained units of the U.S. Navy and the Australian Royal Navy, and before the major naval actions of Leyte Gulf had begun, the HMAS Australia and the USS Honolulu were severely damaged by air attacks. During the battle proper, these 2 cruisers were retiring, escorted by the HMAS Warramunga for repairs in the major Allied base at Manus Island, 1,700 miles away. Well, 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., with Task Force 38, which was commanded by Admiral Mark Mitster as his main component, would provide a more distant cover and support for the invasion. A fundamental defect of this plan was there would be no single American naval admiral in overall command. Kinkaid fell under MacArthur as Supreme Allied Commander of the Southwest Pacific, whereas Halsey's 3rd Fleet reported to Nimitz as the C&C of Pacific Ocean areas. This lack of unity of command, along with the failures of communication, was to produce a crisis and very nearly a strategic disaster for the American forces. Coincidentally, the Japanese plan, using 3 separate fleets, also lacked the overall commander. Well, the Japanese, the American options were apparent to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Combined Fleet Chief Tsuyomo Toyoda prepared 4 victory plans. Shogo 1, Shoicho Saken, was a major naval operation in the Philippines, while 2, 3, and 4 were responses to attacks on Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Kurio Islands, respectively. The plans were for complex offensive operations, committing nearly all available forces to a decisive battle, despite substantially depleting Japanese slender reserves of fuel oil. Well, on October 12, 1944, Halsey began a series of carrier raids against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands with a view of ensuring that the aircraft battle there would not intervene in the Leyte landings. The Japanese command therefore put Shogo 2 into action, launching waves of air attacks against the 3rd Fleet's carriers. In what Admiral Halsey refers to as a knockdown, drag-out fight between carrier-based and land-based air, the Japanese were routed, losing 600 aircraft in 3 days. That's a lot of aircraft going down.
Yes, there is.
That was their almost entire air strength in the region. Following the American invasion of the Philippines, the Japanese Navy made the transition to Shogo 1. Shogo 1 called for Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa ships, known as the Northern Force, to lure the main American covering forces away from Leyte. The Northern Force would be built around several aircraft carriers, but these would have very few aircraft or trained aircrew. The carriers would serve as the main bait. The U.S. covering forces would be lured away. 2 other surface forces would advance on Leyte from the west. The Southern Force, under Vice Admirals Soji Nishimura and Kaihoji Shima, would strike at the landing area in the Suriago Strait. The Center Force, under Vice Admiral Taiko Kurita, would by far the most powerful attacking forces, would pass through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turn southwards, and then also attack the landing area. Now, a note by Tsuyomo Toyota, he stated, "Should we lose the Philippine operations, even though the fleet would be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off, so that the fleet, if it should come back to Japanese water, could not obtain its fuel supply. If it should remain in the southern waters, it could not receive the supplies, ammunitions, and arms. There would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines."
Well, that's nice.
Yeah. Now, first action that they mentioned in sorties from its base in Brunei, Kurita's powerful center force consisted of 5 battleships, the Yamato, the Muashi, Nagato, Kongo, and Huriona, 10 heavy carriers, the Atago, Maya, Taikao, Chokai, Mayoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzoya, Tone, and Chukuma, 2 light cruisers, Noshiro and Yahagi, and 15 destroyers. As Kurita's ships passed the Palawan Island around midnight on the 23rd of October, the American submarines, Darter and Dasi, were positioned together on the surface close by. At 1:16 on the 23rd of October, Darter's radar detected the Japanese formation in the passage at a range of 27,000 meters. Our captain promptly made visual contact, and the 2 submarines quickly moved off in pursuit of the ships, while Darter made the first of 3 contact reports. At least one of these was picked up by a radio operator on the Yamato, but Kurita failed to take appropriate anti-submarine precautions. Well, the Darty and Dasi traveled on the surface at full power for several hours and gained a position ahead of Kurita's formation with the intention of making a submerged attack at first light. The attack was unusually successful. At 5:24, the Darter fired a salvo of 6 torpedoes, which of at least 4 hit the Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago. 10 minutes later, Darter made 2 hits on the Atago's sister ship, Taco, and another spread of torpedoes. At 5:56, the Dasi made 4 torpedo hits to the heavy cruiser Mayo, the sister to Atago and Tayako.
Taco and Mayo.
Taco and Mayo, yeah, it's great names.
I'm sorry.
The Atago and the Maya quickly sank. Atago sank so rapidly that Kurita was forced to swim to survive. He was rescued by the Japanese destroyer Kishishami and was later transferred to the battleship Yamato. Taiko returned back to Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers, and was followed by the 2 submarines. On the 24th of October, as the submarines continued to shadow the damaged cruiser, Darter ran aground in the Bombay Shoal. All efforts to get her off failed. She was abandoned, and the entire crew rescued by the Dasi. Efforts to scuttle the Darter over the course of the next week all failed, including torpedoes from Dasi and rock, which hit the reef, and not Darter, the deck gun shelling from the Dasi, and later the Nautilus. After multiple hits from the 6-inch deck guns, the Nautilus commander determined on the 31st of October that the equipment on Darter was only good for scrap and left her there. The Japanese did not bother with the wreck. Well, the Taco eventually, I love that name, retired to Singapore, being joined in the Japanese in 1945 by a Mayoko, as the ship deemed both crippled cruisers irreparable and left them moored in the harbor as floating anti-aircraft batteries. Now, the Battle of Subian Sea, despite its great strength, the Third Fleet was not well placed to deal with this threat. On the 22nd of October, Halsey detached 2 of his carrier groups to the fleet based at Ulithi to take on provisions and rearm. While Darter's contact report came in, Halsey recalled Davison's group, but allowed Vice Admiral John S. McCain, with the strongest of the TF-38's carrier groups to continue toward the Leyte. Halsey eventually recalled McLean on the 24th of October, but the delay meant that most of the powerful American carrier group played little part in the coming battle, and Third Fleet was effectively deprived of nearly 40% of its air strength. On the morning of the 24th, only 3 groups were available to strike Kurita's force, and one of the best positioned to do so, General F. Bogan's Task Group 38.2, was by mischance the weakest of the groups, containing only 1 large carrier, the USS Intrepid, and 2 light carriers. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Toshiro Onishi directed 3 waves of aircraft from the 1st Air Fleet based on Luzon against the carrier of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's TD-38.3, whose aircraft were also being used to strike airfields to prevent Japanese land-based attacks on Allied shipping in the Leyte Gulf. Each of Oshini's strike waves consisted of some 50 to 60 aircraft. Most of the attacking Japanese planes were intercepted and shot down or driven off by the Hellcats of Sherman's Combat Air Patrol, most notably by 2 fighter sections from the USS Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, who shot down a record 9 of the attacking planes in one action, after which he managed to return and land in extremis on the USS Langley because the Essex deck was too busy to accommodate him, although he had run short of fuel. However, one Japanese aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y-3 Judy, slipped through the defenses and at 9:38 hit the light aircraft carrier USS Princeton with a 551-pound armor-piercing bomb. Just prior to the bomb hitting the carrier, 10 fighter planes had landed on the flight deck from a previous mission, and in the hangar deck of 6 fully loaded and fueled Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers were waiting for the next mission. One of the torpedo bombers was directly hit by this bomb as it pierced the ship and exploded, triggering the other 5 torpedo bombers to also explode. The bomb, kind of boomy. The bomb hit the area of the ship where not only most of the torpedoes were stored, but also the bombs that were not stored securely. This resulting explosion caused a severe fire in Princeton's hangar, and her emergency sprinkler system failed to operate. As the fire spread rapidly, a series of secondary explosions followed. The fire was gradually brought under control, but at 15:23, there was an enormous explosion, probably the carrier's bomb stowage aft, causing more casualties aboard the Princeton and even heavier casualties. 233 died and 426 were wounded aboard the light cruiser Birmingham, which had come back alongside to assist with the firefighting. Birmingham was so badly damaged she was forced to retire. Another light cruiser and 2 more destroyers were also damaged. All efforts to save the Princeton failed, and after the remaining crew were evacuated, she was finally scuttled, torpedoed by the light cruiser Reno at 1750. Of Princeton's crew, 108 men were killed, while 1,361 survivors were rescued by nearby ships. The USS Princeton was the largest American ship lost during the battles around the Leyte Gulf, and only the Independence-class fast carrier sunk in combat during the war. 17 Grumman Hellcat fighters and 12 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers also went down with the Princeton. Now, planes from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot of Bogan's group attacked about 10:30, scoring hits on the battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Muashi, and badly damaged the heavy cruiser Mayoko, with retired to Borneo via Coron Bay. A second wave from the Intrepid, Essex, and the Lexington later attacked, with VB from another 10 hits on the Muashi. As she withdrew, listing to port, the third wave from the Enterprise and Franklin hit her with an additional 11 bombs and 8 torpedoes. After being struck by at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes, the Muashi finally capsized and sank about 19:35 in the evening. In all, 5 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier of the Third Fleet flew 259 sorties with bombs carried by Helldivers and torpedoes launched by the Avengers against the center force on the 24th of October, but this weight of attack was not nearly sufficient to neutralize the threat from Kurita. The largest effort of the Sibuyan Sea attack was directed against just 1 battleship, Muashi, which was sunk, and the carrier Mooko, which was also crippled by an aerial torpedo. Nevertheless, every other ship in Karida's force remained battle-worthy and able to advance. It would be a desperate action and great sacrifice of a much weaker force of show, with 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and 400 aircraft at the Battle of Samar, utterly lacking incredible weapons to sink armored ship to stop Kurita. It also contrasted with the 527 sorties flown by 3rd Fleet against Owaza's much weaker carrier decoy northern force on the following day. Now, Kurita turned his fleet around to get out of range of the aircraft, passing to crippled Muashi as his force retreated. Halsey assumed that this retreat signified that the threat was dealt with for the time being. Kurita, however, waited until about 1715 before turning around again to head for the San Bernardino Strait. As a result of his momentous decision taken by Admiral Halsey and some unclear communication of his plans, Kurita was able to proceed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night to make an unexpected and dramatic appearance off the coast of Samar the following morning, directly threatening the Leyte landings. Now, after the Japanese Southern Center forces had been detected, but before it had been engaged or Ozawa's carriers had been located, Halsey and the staff of the 3rd Fleet aboard the battleship New Jersey prepared a contingency plan to deal with the threat from Kurita's center force. The intention was to cover the San Bernardino fleet with a powerful task force of at least fast battleships supported by 2 of the 3rd Fleet's equally swift carrier groups. The battleship force was to be designated Task Force 34, was to consist of 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers under the command of Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee. Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davidson of Task Group 38.4 would be the overall command of the supporting carrier groups. And on 1512, on the 24th of October, Halsey sent an ambiguously worded telegraphic radio message to his subordinate task group commanders giving details of this contingency plan. Oh, this is a mess. This is the cat on the keyboard, basically.
No.
Bat Div 7, Biloxi, Vincennes, Miami, Desron 52, Les Stephen Potter from TG 38.2, and Washington, Alabama, Wichita, New Orleans, Des Div 100, Patterson, Bagley from TG 38.4 will be formed as Task Force 34 under Vice Admiral Lee, Commander Battle Line, Task Force 34 to engage decisively at long ranges, CTG 38.4 conduct carriers of TG 38.2 and TG 38.4, clear of surface fighting, instructions for TG 38.3 and TG 38.1 later, Halsey, OTC in New Jersey. Some poor guy on a Japanese ship just heard that and probably exploded, trying to write that down as fast as he could. Halsey sent the information copies of his message to Admiral Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters and Admiral King in Washington, but he did not include Admiral Kincaid of 7th Fleet as an information addressee. The message was picked up by 7th Fleet anyway, as it was common for admirals to direct radio operations to copy all message traffic they detected, whether intended for them or not, because Halsey intended the Task Force 34 as a contingency to be formed and detached when he ordered it. By writing "will be formed," he meant in future tense, but neglected to say when the 34 would be formed or under what circumstances. This omission led to Admiral Kincaid of 7th Fleet to believe Halsey was speaking in the present tense, so he concluded that the 34th had been formed and would take station off the San Bernardino Strait. Kincaid's light escort carrier group, lacking battleships for naval action and set up to attack ground troops and submarines, not capital ships, positioned itself south of the strait to support the invasion force. Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor reached exactly the same conclusion. Halsey did send out a second message at 1710 clarifying his intentions. In the enemy sorties, though, through San Bernardino Strait, Task Force 34 will be formed when directed by me. Unfortunately, Halsey sent this second message by voice radio, so the 7th Fleet did not intercept it due to the range limitations of ship-to-ship voice radio networks in use at the time. And Halsey did not follow up with a telegraphic message to Nimitz or King, or vitally, Kincaid. This serious misunderstanding caused by Halsey's imperfect wording the first message and his failure to notify Nimitz, King, or Kincaid of the second clarifying message had a profound influence on the subsequent course of battle, as Kurita's major force almost overwhelmed Kincaid's unprepared lighter force on the doorstep of the Leyte landings. Now, Third Fleet's aircraft failed to locate Owaza's northern force until 1640 on the 24th of October. This was largely because Third Fleet had been preoccupied with attacking Kurita's sizable center force and defending itself against the Japanese airstrikes from Luzon. Thus, the one Japanese force that wanted to be discovered, Owaza's tempting decoy of a large carrier group, which only had 108 aircraft, was the only force the Americans had not been able to find.
Oops. We're talented.
It's like, we're out here fishing for you. Can't you see us? Hey, guys. Yo.
Apparently we can't play Battleship.
No, not very well. On the evening of the 24th of October, Owaza intercepted a mistaken American communication describing Kurita's withdrawal. He therefore began to withdraw too. However, at 2000, Toyota ordered his forces to attack, counting on divine assistance.
Oh.
Trying to draw.
God.
No, divine.
Which god?
Huh?
Which god?
Probably the samurai.
Oh, okay.
Owaza reversed course again and headed southwards towards Leyte. Halsey fell for the Japanese decoy, convinced the northern force constituted the main Japanese threat, and he was determined to seize what he saw as a golden opportunity to destroy Japan's last remaining carrier strength. Believing center force had been neutralized by Third Fleet's airstrikes earlier in the day at the Sibuyan Sea, and its remnants were retiring, Halsey radioed to Nimitz and Kincaid, Central force heavily damaged according to strike reports, and proceeding north with 3 groups to attack carrier forces at dawn. The words, with 3 groups, proved dangerously misleading. In light of the intercepted 5:24, 24th October, will be formed as Task Force 34 message from Halsey, Admiral Kincaid and his staff assumed, as did Admiral Nimitz, that the Task Force 34, commanded by Vice Admiral Lee, had been formed as a separate entity. They assumed that Halsey was leaving this powerful surface force guarding the San Bernardino Strait and covering 7th Fleet's northern flank, while he took the 3 available carrier groups northwards in pursuit of the Japanese carriers. But the 34th Task Force had not been detached from the other forces, and Lee's battleships were on their way northwards with 3rd Fleet's carriers. As Woodward wrote, everything was pulled out of the San Bernardino Strait, not so much as a picket destroyer was left. Well, Halsey and his staff officers ignored information from a night reconnaissance aircraft operating from the light carrier Independence that Kurita's powerful surface force had turned back towards the San Bernardino Strait, and that after a long blackout, the navigation lights of the strait had been turned on. When Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan, commanding the Task Group 38.2, radioed this information to Halsey's flagship, he was rebuffed by a staff officer who tersely replied, yes, we have that information. Vice Admiral Lee, who had correctly deduced that Owaza's force had been a decoy mission and indicated that this in a blinker message to Halsey's flagship, what similarly was rebuffed. It's like when people find facts and they don't want to believe them. Gosh, sounds like the military way.
No.
Now, Commodore Arleigh Burke and Commander James H. Flatley of Mitscher's staff had come to the same conclusion. They were sufficiently worried that the situation to wake Mitscher, who asked, does Admiral Halsey have that report? On being told that Halsey did, Mitscher, knowing Halsey's temperament, commented, if he wants my advice, he'll ask for it, and went back to sleep. Now, the entire available strength of the 3rd Fleet continued to steam northwards towards Owaza's decoy force, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Nothing lay between the battleships of Kurita's Central Force and the American landing vessels, except for Kincaid's vulnerable escort carrier group off the coast of Samar. Now, the Battle of Sarago Strait is significant and is the last battleship-to-battleship action in history. The Battle of Sarago Strait was one of only 2 battleship versus battleship naval battles in the entire Pacific campaign of World War II. The other happened at the Guadalcanal campaign, where Washington sank the Japanese battleship Kirishima. It was also the most recent battle in which one force, in this case the U.S. Navy, was able to cross the T of its opponent. However, By the time that the battleship action was joined, the Japanese line was very ragged and consisted of only one battleship, the Yamashiro, one heavy cruiser, and one destroyer, so that crossing of the T was notational and had little effect on the outcome of the battle. Now, Nishimura's southern force consisted of the old battleships Yamashiro, the flagship, and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mamagi, and 4 destroyers, the Shiguri, Murashiro, Asagumo, and the Yamagumo. Now, this task force left Boronai after Kurita on the 5th and at 1500 on the 22nd of October, turning towards the Sulu Sea. No relation to Star Trek there.
Oh, no.
And then northeasterly past the southern tip of Negros Island into the Mindanao Sea. Nishimura then proceeded northward with Mindanao Island to starboard and into the south entrance of the Surigao Strait, intending to exit the north entrance of the strait into Leyte Gulf, which he would add to his firepower of Kurita's force. The Japanese second striking force was commanded by Vice Admiral Coyote Shima and comprised of the heavy cruisers Nyachi and Ashigara, the light cruiser Abakama, and the destroyers Ekabono, Uisho, Kasumi, and Shirauni. The Japanese southern force was attacked by the U.S. Navy bombers on the 24th of October, but sustained only minor damage. The destroyer Wakaba was the only ship sunk during this action. Now, Nishimura was unable to synchronize his movements with Shima and Kurita because the strict radio silence imposed on the center and southern forces. When they entered the Surigao Strait at 2 a.m., Shima was 25 nautical miles behind him, and Kurita was still in the Sibian Sea several hours from the beaches at Leyte. Well, as the Japanese southern forces approached the Surigao Strait, it ran into a deadly trap set by the 7th Fleet. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had a substantial force comprising of 6 battleships, the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the California, and the Pennsylvania, which carried 48 14-inch guns and 16 16-inch guns. Now, 4 heavy cruisers, the USS Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, the HMAS Shropshire, which carried 35 8-inch guns, 4 light cruisers, the Denver, Columbia, Phoenix, and Boise, which carried 54 6-inch guns, and 28 destroyers and 39 motor torpedo boats with smaller guns and torpedoes. Now, interesting enough, 5 of the 6 battleships had been sunk or damaged at the attack on Pearl Harbor, as subsequently repaired, or in the cases of the Tennessee, Carolina, and West Virginia, rebuilt. The sole exception was the Mississippi, which had been in Iceland on convoy escort duty at the time. To pass through the Narrows and reach the invasion shipping, Nishimura would have to run the gauntlet of torpedoes from the PT boats and destroyers before advancing into the concentrated fire of 14 battleships and cruisers deployed across the far mouth of the strait. Shooting gallery! At 22:36, PT-131, under the control of Ensign Peter Gadd, was operating off Bohol when he made contact with the approaching Japanese ships. The PT boats made repeated attacks for more than 3.5 hours as Nishimura's force steamed northward. No torpedo hits were scored, but the PT boats did send contact reports that were of use to Oldendorf and his force. Nishimura's ships passed unscathed through the gauntlet of PT boats. However, their luck ran out a short time later when they were subjected to devastating torpedo attacks from the destroyers deployed on both sides of their axis in advance. About 3 o'clock, both Japanese battleships were hit by torpedoes. Yamashiro was able to steam on, but the Fuso, torpedoed by the USS Melvin and fell out of formation, sank 40 minutes later. 2 of Mashiro's 4 destroyers were sunk. The destroyer Asagumo was hit and forced to retire, but later sank. Now, the traditional account of sinking of Fuso was that she exploded into 2 halves that remained floating for some time. However, Fuso survivor Hideo Owagawa, interrogated, stated in 1945 in an article, shortly after 4 a.m., the ship capsized slowly to starboard, and Ogawa and others were washed away without specifically mentioning the bisection. Fuso was hit on the starboard side by 2 or possibly 3 torpedoes, One of these started an oil fire, and the fuel used by IJN ships was poorly refined and easily ignited. Burning patches of fuel could have led to the description Allied observers of the Fuso blowing up. However, battleships were known sometimes to be cut in 2 or 3 sections, which could remain afloat independently, and Samuel Morrison stated that the bow half of Fuso was sunk by gunfire from Louisville, and the stern half sank off of Kyanan Island. While the battle would continue, the West Virginia radar picked up the surviving ships on Nishimura's force at a range of about 24 miles. West Virginia tracked them as they approached in the pitch-black night, and at 3:53 a.m. she fired the 8 16-inch guns of her main battery at a range of 13 miles, striking Yamashiro with the first salvo. She went on for a total of 93 shells.
Oh, wow.
At 3:55, the California and the Tennessee joined in, firing 63 and 69 shells respectively from their 14-inch guns. Radar fire control allowed these American battleships to hit targets with a distance which the Japanese battleships and their inferior fire control systems couldn't return fire. That would be kind of sucky. All of a sudden you hear this whistling noise going, this isn't going to be good. And all of a sudden an explosion hit. Ouch. The other 3 U.S. battleships also had difficulty with their equipment as their less advanced gunnery radar. Pennsylvania was unable to find their target and her guns remained silent. Maryland eventually succeeded in visually ranging on the splashes of the other battleship shells, then fired a total of 48 16-inch projectiles. The Mississippi only fired once in the battle line action, a full salvo of 12 14-inch shells. These were the last salvo ever fired by a battleship against another battleship in history, closing a significant chapter in naval warfare. Now, the Yoshiro and the Mogami were crippled by a combination of 16 and 14-inch armor-piercing shells, as well as the fire of Old Norse flanking cruisers. The cruisers had the latest radar equipment, fired well over 2,000 rounds of armor-piercing 6-inch and 8-inch shells. The Louisville, the flagship of Oldendorf, fired 37 salvos, 333 rounds of 8-inch shells. The Japanese command had apparently lost grasp of the tactical picture, and with all ships firing all batteries in several directions, frantically showering steel through 360 degrees, Shigure turned and fled, but lost steering and stopped dead.
What?
The Yamashiro was struck by a torpedo fired by the destroyer Benion, suddenly sank about 4:20, and with Nishirama on board. Mogami and Shigure retreated southwards down the strait. The destroyer Albert W. Grant was hit by friendly fire during the night battle, but didn't sink. The rear of the Japanese Southern Force, the second striking force commanded by Vice Admiral Shima, had departed from Mako and was approaching the Shigaro Strait about 40 miles astern of Nishirama. Shima's run was initially thrown into confusion when his force nearly ran aground at Panawan Island after failing to factor in the outgoing tide into their approach. That might be something an admiral might know. I don't know. Japanese radar was almost useless due to excessive reflections from the many islands. The American radar was equally unable to detect ships in these conditions, especially PT boats, but PT-137 hit the light cruiser Abukuma with a torpedo that crippled her and caused her to fall out of formation. Shima's 2 heavy cruisers, the Nachi and Ashigara, 4 destroyers, next encountered remnants of the Nishimura's force. Shima saw what he thought were wrecks of both Nishimura's battleships and ordered a retreat. His flagship Nachi collided with the Mogami, flooding Mogami's steering room and causing her to fall behind in the retreat. She was further damaged by American carrier aircraft the next morning, abandoned and then scuttled with a torpedo from the Akabono. Now, I have to say it is probably both a terrifying weapon, but also it showed you how desperate the Japanese were. With the Battle of Samar raging between Japanese surface fleet and Taffy 3, Taffy 1's escort carriers were supporting the American surface ships after the Battle of Sagaro Strait. When daylight broke, the nighttime Sagaro Strait action meant no carrier aircraft could participate until dawn, during which the retreated Japanese Southern Fleet was in full retreat. As a result, Taffy 1 being so far south from Samar, not many Taffy 1 airplanes participated in the Battle of Samar. While in the air southwest of Leyte Gulf, the aircraft and ships of Taffy 1 were immediately ordered to assist Taffy 3 off the Samar, but they had to return to escort aircraft carriers to refuel and rearm. After the Japanese carriers returned from aerial attacks on the retreating Japanese naval forces at Sagaro Strait, Japanese launched their first pre-planned kamikaze attacks against the Taffy 1 from Davao. The escort carrier Santee was hit by a kamikaze, killing 16 crewmen. A Japanese submarine also successfully launched a torpedo at Santee, striking her starboard side. 4 Avenger torpedo bombers and 2 Wildcat fighters on Santee were destroyed in this attack. Emergency repairs saved the Santee from sinking. The escort carrier Suwannee was shortly afterwards hit by a kamikaze, killing 71 sailors. Suwannee was hit by another kamikaze around noon on the 26th, which caused even more damage, killing 36 more crewmen. This second kamikaze attack caused a large fire that was not extinguished until 9 hours later. A total of 107 sailors were killed and over 150 were wounded on the Suwannee in the kamikaze attacks on the 25th and 26th of October. 5 Avenger torpedo bombers and 9 Hellcat fighters were also destroyed. Now, of Nishirama's 7 ships, only Shigure survived long enough to escape the debacle, but eventually succumbed to the American submarine Blackfin on the 24th of January 1945, which sank her off Kota Baru in Malaya with 37 dead. Shima's ships did survive the Battle of Sorgaro Strait, but they were sunk in further engagements around Leyte. The southern force provided no further threat to the Leyte landings. Now, the prelude to the Battle off Samar on the 25th of October 1944, Halsey's decision to take all the available strength of 3rd Fleet northwards and attack the carriers the Japanese northern force had left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Senior sailors in the 7th Fleet, including Kincaid and his staff, generally assumed Halsey was taking his 3 available carrier groups northwards. McCain's group, the strongest of the fleet, was still returning from the direction of Uhuli, but leaving the battleships of Task Force 34 covering the San Bernardino Strait against Japan's carrier force. In fact, Halsey had not formed Task Force 34, and all 6 of Willis Lee's battleships were on their way northwards with the carriers, as well as every available cruiser and destroyer of 3rd Fleet. Korea's Central Force, therefore, emerged unopposed from the San Bernardino Strait on the 25th, steamed southward along the coast of the island of Samar. In its path only stood 7th Fleet's 3 escort carrier units, call signs Taffy 1, 2, and 3, with a total of 16 small, very slow, and unarmored escort carriers, which carried up to 28 planes each, protected by a screen of lightly armed and unarmored destroyers and smaller destroyer escorts. Despite the losses in the Palawan Passage and the Subian Sea actions, the Japanese center force was still very powerful, consisting of 4 battleships, including the giant Yamato, 6 heavy carriers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Well, Kurita's force caught Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit by surprise, Taffy 3. Sprague directed his carriers to launch their planes and then ran for the cover of a rain squall to the east. He ordered the destroyers and the destroyer escorts to make a smokescreen to conceal the retreating carriers. Kurita, unaware that Owaza's decoy plan had succeeded, assumed he had found a carrier group from Halsey's 3rd Fleet. Having just redeployed his ships in anti-aircraft formation, he gave the complicated matters by ordering a general attack in which it called for his fleet to split into divisions and attack independently. Now, the destroyer, the USS Johnson, was closest to the enemy on its own initiative. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, 3 E's, wow, steered his hopelessly outclassed ship into the Japanese fleet at flank speed. Johnson fired his torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kamano, damaging her and forcing her out of line. Seeing this, Sprague gave the order for small boys attack, sending the rest of Taffy 3's screening ships into the fray. Taffy 3's other 2 destroyers, Howell and Heerman, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, attacked with suicidal determination,
drawing fire and disrupting the Japanese formation as the ship turned to avoid the torpedoes. As the ships approached the enemy columns, Lieutenant Commander Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts told all hands via bullhorn that this would be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. I'm reassured.
Yes.
As the Japanese fleet continued to approach, Hull and Roberts were hit multiple times and quickly sank. After expending all its torpedoes, Johnson quickly continued to fight with its 5-inch guns until it was sunk by a group of Japanese destroyers.
Well, 5-inch guns are like...
Yeah.
That's teeny.
That tiny thing might as well throw a rock. As they were preparing for their aircraft to attack, the escort carriers returned to the Japanese fire with all the firepower they had. 1 5-inch gun per carrier. Wow, dudes. Again, throw a rock. The firepower that they had, Officer and Tactical Command had instructed the carriers to open with pea shooters, and each ship took an enemy vessel under fire as soon as it came within range. The Fanshawe Bay fired on a cruiser, and it's believed to have registered 5 hits, one amid the superstructure that caused smoke. Callan Bay targeted a Miyoko-class heavy cruiser, claiming a hit on the cruiser's number 2 turret, with the second just below the first. Gambler Bay sighted a cruiser and claimed at least 3 hits. White Plains reported hits on multiple targets, 2 between the superstructure and forward stack, and another on the number 1 turret of a heavy cruiser. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, no relation to Clifton, ordered the 16 escort carriers in his 3 task units immediately launch all their aircraft, a total of 450 planes. That's kind of impressive.
That is.
Equipped with whatever weapons they had available, even if this were only machine guns or depth charges. The escort carriers had planes more suited for patrol and anti-submarine duties, including the older models such as the FM-2 Wildcat, although they also had TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, in contrast with Halsey's fleet carriers, which were the newest aircraft of ample anti-shipping ordnance. However, that fact, the Japanese force had no air cover, meant that the Sprague's planes could attack unopposed by Japanese fighter aircraft. Consequently, the air counterattacks were almost unceasing, and some, especially several of the strikes launched from the Felix Stump's Task Force 77.4.2, Taffy 2, were heavy. The carriers of Taffy 3 turned south and retreated through the shell fire. Gambler Bay at the rear of the American formation became the focus of the battleship Yamato and sustained multiple hits before capsizing at 9:07 a.m. 4 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers went down at the Gambier Bay. Several other carriers were damaged, but were able to escape. Now, the ferocity of the American defense seemed confirmed the Japanese assumption that they were engaging major fleet units rather than merely escort carriers and destroyers. The confusion of the general attack order was compounded by the air and torpedo attacks when Korea's flagship Yamato turned north to evade torpedoes and lost contact with the battle. Where's the battle? We don't know. We're out here just sailing along. Korea abruptly broke off the fight and gave the order all ships, my course north, speed 20, apparently to regroup his disorganized fleet. Korea's battle report stated he had received a message indicating the group of American carriers was steaming north of him. Preferring to expend his fleet against capital ships rather than transports, Korea set out in pursuit and thereby lost his opportunity to destroy the shipping fleet in the Leyte Gulf and disrupt the vital landings at Leyte. After failing to intercept the non-existent carriers, which were much further north, Korea finally retreated towards San Bernardino Strait. 3 of his heavy cruisers were sunk, and the determined resistance had convinced him that the persisting with the attack would only cause further Japanese losses. Poor communication between the separate Japanese forces and a lack of air reconnaissance meant that Korea was never informed that the deception had been successful, and that only a small and outgunned force between the battleships and the vulnerable transports of the invasion fleet. Thus, Korea remained convinced that he had been engaging elements of the Third Fleet, and it would only be a matter of time before Halsey surrounded and annihilated him. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague wrote to his colleague, Aubrey Finch, after the war, "I stated to Admiral Nimitz that the main reason they turned north was that they were receiving too much damage to continue, and I'm still of the opinion, and cold analysis will eventually confirm it." Almost all of Korea's surviving force escaped. Halsey and Third Fleet's battleships returned too late to cut them off. Nagato and Congo were moderately damaged by air attack from Taffy 3's escort carriers, and Kurita had begun the battle with 5 battleships. On their return to their bases, only Yamato and Hiraganga remained battle-worthy. As the desperate surface action was coming to an end, Vice Admiral Takuro Oshini put his Japanese special attack units into operation from bases on Luzon, using kamikaze air attacks against the Allied ships in the Leyte Gulf and the escort carrier groups off Samar. This was the second ever organized kamikaze attack by the Japanese in World War II, after the kamikaze attack on Taffy 1 a few hours earlier. The escort carrier St. Lo of Taffy 3 was hit by a kamikaze aircraft and sank after a series of external explosions. 6 Grumman Wildcat fighters and 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers went down with the St. Lo. 3 other Taffy 3 escort carriers, the USS Cowan Bay, USS Pitcairn Bay, and White Plains, were also damaged by the same kamikaze attacks. Now, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Owaza's northern force, built around the 4 aircraft carriers of the 3rd Carrier Division, Zuwaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the light carriers Zuyo, Chitos, and Toyota, included two World War I battleships partly converted to carriers. The Hyuga and Issy, 2 aft turrets had been replaced by a hangar, aircraft handling deck, and catapult, but neither ship carried any aircraft in this battle. 3 light cruisers, Oyota, Tama, and Isuzu, that's a car,
Yeah.
and 9 destroyers. Now, Owaza's carrier group was a decoy force divested of all but 108 aircraft, intended to lure the American fleet away from protecting the transports at the landing beaches on Leyte Island. Now, Owaza's force was not located until 1640 on the 24th of October, largely because Sherman's Task Group 38.3, which was the northernmost of Halsey's groups, was responsible for searching in this sector. The force that Halsey was taking north with him, 3 groups of Minshir's Task Force 38, was overwhelmingly stronger than his Japanese northern force. Between them, the groups had 5 large fleet aircraft carriers: the Intrepid, the Franklin, the Lexington, the Enterprise, and the Essex. They had 5 light carriers: the Independence, Bellewood, Langley, Cabot, and the San Jacinto. 6 modern battleships: the Alabama, the Iowa, the Massachusetts, the New Jersey, the South Dakota,
Woo.
and the Washington. 8 cruisers, 2 heavy and 6 light, and 41 destroyers. That's a heck of a fleet.
Nah, tiny.
Super tiny?
Super tiny.
No.
Barely see it.
Hide it in one pocket.
Right.
The air groups of the 10 U.S. carriers presented between 600 and 1,000 aircraft.
Yeah.
Minor task force there. On the 25th of October, about 2:40 in the morning, Halsey detached Task Force 34, built from 3rd Fleet's 6 battleships and commanded by Vice Admiral Lee. As dawn approached, the 6 ships of Task Force 34 drew ahead of the carrier groups. Halsey intended Michener to make airstrikes following the heavy gunfire of Lee's battleships. Around dawn on the 25th of October, Ozawa launched 75 aircraft, the bulk of his few aircraft, to attack the 3rd Fleet. Most were shot down by the American combat air patrols, and no damage was done to the U.S. ships. A few Japanese planes survived and made their way to land bases on Luzon. During the night, Halsey had passed tactical command of 38 to Admiral Mitcher, who ordered the American carrier groups to launch their first strike wave of 180 aircraft at dawn, before the northern force had been located. When the search aircraft made contact at 7:10, this strike wave was orbiting ahead of the task force. At 8 a.m., as the attack went on, its escorting fighters destroyed Ozawa's combat air patrol of about 30 planes. The U.S. airstrikes continued until the evening, at which time Task Force 38 had flown 527 sorties against the northern force, sinking Zukuku, the light carriers Chuasi and Zoihu, and the destroyer Akuzi, all with heavy loss of life. The light carrier Chiyoda and carrier Tama were crippled. Ozawa transferred his flag to the light cruiser Oedo. Now, shortly after 8 a.m. on the 25th, desperate messages calling for assistance began to come in from 7th Fleet, which had been engaging Nishimura's southern force in the battle at Sagaro Strait since 2 a.m. One message from Kincaid, sent in plain English, read, "My situation is critical. Fast battleships and support by airstrikes may be able to keep the enemy from destroying CVEs and entering Leyte." Halsey recalled his memoirs. He was shocked at this message, recounting that the radio signals from 7th Fleet had come in at random, in and out of order, because of the backing of the signals office. It seems he did not receive the vital message from Kincaid until around 10 a.m. Halsey later claimed he knew Kincaid was in trouble, but did not dream the seriousness of this crisis. One of the most alarming signals from Kincaid reported, after their battle at the Sagaro Strait, 7th Fleet's own battleships were critically low on ammunition. Even this failed to persuade Halsey to send any immediate assistance to 7th Fleet. In fact, 7th Fleet's battleships were not as short of ammunition as Kincaid's signal implied, but Halsey did not know that. From 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz had been monitoring the desperate calls from Taffy 3 and sent Halley a terse message. "Turkey trots to water GG from Sinpak, Action Com, 3rd Fleet Info, comments, Combat Force 77, where is report when Task Force 34 for the World Wonders?" The first 4 words in the last 3 were padding, using to confuse enemy cryptanalysis. The beginning and end of the true message was marked by double consonants. The communications staff on Halsey's flagship correctly deleted the first section of padding, but mistakenly retained the last 3 words in the message, finally handed to Halsey. The last 3 words, probably selected by communications officer at Nimitz's office, may have been made as a loose quote from Tennyson's poems The Charge of the Light Brigade, suggesting that by coincidence this day, the 25th, was the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava, which is not intended as a commentary of the current crisis off Leyte.
What?
Halsey, however, when reading the message, thought the last words, "the world wonders," were a biting piece of criticism from Nimitz, threw his cap to the deck, and broke into sobs of rage.
Wow.
Rear Admiral Robert Carney, his chief of staff, confronted him, telling Halsey, "Stop it! What the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together." Eventually, at 11:15, more than 3 hours after the first distress message from the 7th Fleet had been received by his flagship, Halsey ordered Task Force 34 to turn around and head south towards Samar. At this point, Lee's battleships were almost within gun range of Owazo's force. 2.5 hours were then spent refueling the 34th Company's destroyers. After the succession of delays, it was too late for Task Force 34 to give any practical help to the 7th Fleet, other than assist of picking up survivors from Taffy 3, and it was too late to even intercept Carita's force before it made its escape through the San Bernardino Strait. Nevertheless, at 16:22 in the evening, in a desperate and even more belated attempt to intervene in the events off Samar, Halsey formed a new task force, the 34.5, under Rear Admiral Oscar C. Badger II, built around the 3rd Fleet's 2 fastest battleships, the Iowa and the New Jersey. Both were capable of speed more than 37 miles per hour, and 34's 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers sped southwards, leaving Lee and the other 4 battleships to follow. As Morrison observes, if Badger's group had succeeded in intercepting the Japanese center force, it may have been outgunned by Carita's battleships. Now, cruisers and destroyers of the 34.5, however, caught the Japanese destroyer Niwaki, the last straggler center force off the San Bernardino Strait, and sank her with all hands, including survivors from the Chicoma. Now, when Halsey finally turned the Task Force 34 southwards at 11:15 a.m., he detached a task group of 4 cruisers and 9 of its destroyers under Rear Admiral DuBose and reassigned the group to 38 Task Force. At 14:15, Michener ordered DuBose to pursue the remnants of the Japanese Northern Force. His cruisers finished off the light carrier Chiyoda at about 5 p.m., and at 20:59 p.m., his ships sank the cruiser Hadazuki after a very stubborn fight. When Ozawa learned the deployment of DuBois' relatively weak task group, he ordered the battleships East and Huga to turn southward and attack it, but they failed to locate this group, which they heavily outgunned. Halsey's withdrawal of all 6 of Lee's battleships in his attempt to assist the 7th Fleet now rendered the Task Force 38 vulnerable to a surface counterattack by the decoy Northern Force. Around 2310, the American submarine Haleo torpedoed and sank the light cruiser Tama of Oaza's force. This was the last act of the battle off Cape Inagano, and apart from some final strikes of the retreating Japanese forces, on the 26th, the conclusion of the battle for Leyte Gulf. Now, to go ahead and punch this in by the numbers, this was kind of interesting when they ran it all the way through. Because like they said, the Japanese knew that they were hopelessly outgunned. For the strength, the Allies, the United States, and Australia had about 300 ships total. 8 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 18 escort carriers, and 12 battleships. Those are the big damage. Boom, boom. Japan, which had gathered all of their ships that they still had left, were able to bring about 67 ships in total. However, they only had 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, and 2 hybrid carriers that used to be battleships, and 7 battleships. So right there, the Allies already had an American advantage. The big thing also is that the Japanese were trying to stop an invasion. That basically was going to turn out to be their biggest mistake. Now, for casualties, the United States lost about 3,000 people. They lost 255 planes, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, a light carrier, and 12 total ships. The Japanese, they lost 12,000 people. That's 4 times as many. They lost 28 ships, more than half, more than double the U.S. They lost their 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, and more planes, about 300 planes total. But by that action, it pretty much was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy's effort. I think towards the end of the war, one of the last options that they had was that they sent the Yamato up to Okinawa with no intention of her being able to be strong enough to return back to the mainland. They were hoping that it would deter us from landing and capturing Okinawa. But this is our little history tidbit for the day on the 25th of October from 1944. Folks, have a good lesson, and we'll see you next week.
Mm.
Bye-bye.
It's after midnight. Good night.